Our legislation will prohibit the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. It will empower the courts to remove intimate images from the internet, and it will also give the courts the power to order the seizure of computers, cell phones, or other devices used to commit the offence. As we have seen far too often, Mr. Speaker, cyberbullying destroys the lives of children. It clearly demands a stronger criminal justice response. That's what this legislation will do. I ask all members of this House, stand up, protect the children of this nation, and support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Alfred Pellan. Mr. Speaker, I'm from Laval, so I know something about crooked mayors, so I sympathize with the people of Toronto. At least our mayor, who squandered money instead of crack, resigned without the Conservatives coming to his defence. But we can all be consoled, whether it be in Laval, Montreal, or Toronto. No one comes up with more ridiculous excuses than the Conservatives to defend the schemes of the PMO. They can invoke their selective memory as much as they want, but Nigel Wright said it clearly. The Prime Minister was aware of the broad lines of the scandal. When Rob Ford, Gilles Vaillancourt, and Gérald Tremblay are more credible than the Prime Minister, then there's a problem. The puppets can applaud the talking points of the kids in short pants from the PMO, even when the police are after them, but we're going to continue to call for accountability. Canadians deserve better, they deserve the truth, and they know that only the chief prosecutor of this House, the leader of the NDP, will get that.
The honourable member for Huron-Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been 10 long days since the Liberal Party reminded Canadians that they just don't trust them with their hard-earned money. On Remembrance Day, no less, the Liberal Party slammed veterans by saying giving money to veterans who are injured in the service of Canada is like hanging a case of beer in front of a drunk. They go and spend it on booze and addiction. Veterans are scratching their heads. How can the Liberal Veterans Affairs critics claim to stand up for veterans and criticize their intentions at the same time? Veterans deserve better, Mr. Speaker. How many more days do veterans have to wait for the leader of the Liberal Party to fire his veterans spokesman?
Good question. Oral questions. Questions are the honourable leader of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, never before in the history of Canada have we seen this kind of situation, that crimes were committed in the office of a sitting Prime Minister by his own personnel and in his name. Corruption, fraud, breach of trust. We're talking about criminal activities organized and executed by people for whom only the Prime Minister is responsible. Why is the Prime Minister incapable of rising in this House to assume his responsibilities?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, what we saw yesterday is the fact that the Prime Minister actually took extraordinary leadership on this matter, Mr. Speaker. It's quoted right in the documents, Mr. Speaker. Rob Staley, legal representative for the PMO, advised my office that he has clear orders from the Prime Minister to provide complete cooperation with the investigation and to provide any assistance or documentation that the RCMP requested, Mr. Speaker. That's real leadership. That's the leadership that this Prime Minister has been showing, Mr. Speaker. Also, it says in there quite clearly that the Prime Minister did not know, and as the Prime Minister said, had he known, he would have in no way endorsed such a scheme.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
On May 28th, I asked the Prime Minister what instructions he gave his staff on the Mike Duffy scandal. You know what he said? I'll quote him word for word. I did not give any such instructions. Really? Clintonian answer. Yesterday's court documents prove that those words are the opposite of the truth. Not only did Nigel Wright get instruction from the Prime Minister, he even got approval. We're good to go. Based on that alone, the Prime Minister has engaged in a cover-up of crimes in his own office. Why the cover-up if he didn't do anything wrong?
Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the documentation says no such thing. What it says is that the Prime Minister, at the moment he found out about this, he went into his office and instructed his office to cooperate fully with the RCMP, Mr. Speaker. As I've said on a number of occasions in this House, on February 13th, when Senator Duffy approached the Prime Minister to justify his inappropriate expenses, the Prime Minister told him he had to repay those expenses, Mr. Speaker. That is something that's been very clear. Documentation also shows that the Prime Minister did not know about this, and as the Prime Minister said, had he known about this scheme, he would have in no way endorsed such a scheme.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister admitted that he said to Nigel Wright that he was good to go. When confronted with that, the Prime Minister told another nose stretcher he claims that he meant good to go with Mike Duffy paying his own expenses. That's what he meant. Well, in that case, there's really only one question. Since when does the Prime Minister of Canada have to approve a senator repaying his own expenses?
Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said on a number of occasions, the Prime Minister has said the standard that we expect on this side of the House, that if you had some expenses that you did not incur, you should not be accepting those expenses, Mr. Speaker. But when he talks about things not really shaping up, how about him, Mr. Speaker? He was offered a bribe 17 years ago. 17 years. Did he reach out to the police? No, he didn't reach out to the police, Mr. Speaker. He didn't think it was important. He didn't look in the envelope that was offered him across the table, Mr. Speaker. Why didn't you tell the police 17 years ago and spare the people of Quebec?
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Totalement absurd.
That is completely absurd. It is absurd to claim that a senator needs the approval of the Prime Minister to repay expenses. Nobody in Canada believes that, Mr. Speaker.
Page 71 of the RCMP document says, quote, the Prime Minister was informed by his staff that they were working on a plan. Yesterday, the Prime Minister's so-called spokesman over there said, quote, the Prime Minister expected more from his staff. Not just from Nigel Wright, from his whole staff. So why is only Nigel Wright the one to have lost his job?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the documents clearly show that it is Senator Duffy and Nigel Wright who are the subject of this investigation, Mr. Speaker. But I tell you what's awkward and obscure. Let me quote this, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition said he never reached out to the police himself because he had no proof that what he was actually being offered was a bribe. And then he didn't look into the envelope to see what was there. But then you would have thought when this started happening in Quebec, he would have reached out proactively to the police. But once the investigation started, he was contacted by the police. He didn't think it was important enough to call them, Mr. Speaker. That's not the standard.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
It's a concept, Mr. Speaker. True, false, good, bad, legal, illegal. Saying no to the envelope, handing out the envelope. Exactly. Senators Tkachuk, Le Breton, and Stuart Olson publicly denied that they had ever been told by the Prime Minister's office to change the report on Duffy. All three denied. According to the RCMP, all three lied. In court documents, the RCMP, through dozens of emails, show how the report was doctored on orders of...
The Leader of the Opposition should know that we don't use a word like that in parliamentary language here in the chamber, even if it's so the parliamentarian. The Honourable Member for Wascana.
Speaker, the RCMP say they have reasonable cause to believe that the Prime Minister's senior entourage was engaged in a scheme of bribery, fraud and breach of trust. It's Wright and it's Duffy and it's at least a dozen more, the fraud squad in the PMO. But they first plotted to have the Conservative Party pay Duffy, and for that, the police say, they did consult the Prime Minister and got a good to go. But such a payment would have been just as wrong as the payment by Nigel Wright. Why did the Prime Minister say good to go for a payment from the Conservative Party?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Of course, the Prime Minister said no such thing, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister was very clear on February 13th when he was approached by Senator Duffy that to justify these expenses. He was very clear and he said you had to repay those expenses. But what we're hearing now from the angry leader of the opposition is that hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. It's okay to deny something for 17 years. It's okay not to address the police when clearly corruption is happening in Quebec. That's all right, Mr. Speaker. That's not the type of leadership Canadians want. The type of leadership they want is the leadership shown by this Prime Minister, who immediately, when he found out, took immediate action, unlike that member who waited 17 years.
The Honourable Member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, they've just contradicted the police over there. It doesn't matter whether the amount was $32,000 or $90,000. It doesn't matter whether it was paid by the Conservative Party or by Nigel Wright. Either way, it's bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And the RCMP say they have reasonable cause to believe those crimes were committed by that fraud squad in the PMO. And now that same gang is out in Brandon running the Conservative by-election. Why hasn't the Prime Minister fired the fraud squad instead of empowering them to do more damage to Brandon and to Canada?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Go figure that the Liberals would ask a question about Brandon. It's like Veterans Affairs, Mr. Speaker. In the week leading up to Veterans Affairs, they're concerned. As soon as it's done, not a question. I'll tell you what the people of Brandon are like. They're like the people of Oak Ridge's Markham. They don't agree with the Liberal leader who wants to take away marketing freedom for their farmers. They don't agree with the Liberal leader who thinks that a dictatorship should be is a form of government that he's most proud of. They don't agree with the Liberal leader who thinks that minimum mandatory sentences for heinous crimes should be removed. They don't agree with the Liberal leader who thinks that families should pay more taxes, Mr. Speaker. What they want is a government and a member of Parliament who will stand up for them before, during, and after an election. And that's what they'll get.
The Honourable Member for Wascana.
And that's why they'll vote Liberal. Mr. Speaker, police records show Senator Gerstein tried to hamper the Deloitte audit. That's obstruction of justice. They show LeBreton, Tkachuk, and Stuart Olson whitewashed a Senate report on Duffy. That's corruption of a parliamentary process, all ordered by the fraud squad in the PMO, and all part of the crimes that police believe were committed by the Prime Minister's most inner circle. Most of those people still work for the Prime Minister. How could the CEO of such an operation be so negligent and so incompetent to inject...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Sorry, when he talks about the CEO of an organization, I can only assume that he's talking about the former Prime Minister that he worked under, who, of course, as we know, Mr. Speaker, we still have some outstanding $40 million that are...
The Honourable Member for Hamilton Mountain.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives claim that the Prime Minister was not aware of the $90,000 payoff. But the RCMP alleges that the Prime Minister was broadly aware and that he signed off on something. We just don't know what. We do know the Prime Minister's senior staff were devoting large amounts of time and effort to this cover-up. Will the member confirm that the Prime Minister was briefed, in broad terms, on his staff's efforts to solve the problem with Mike Duffy's expenses?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, I've said that on a number of occasions in the House. I'll go over the timeline once again for the Honourable Member. February 13th, Senator Duffy approached the Prime Minister to try and justify his inappropriate expenses, and the Prime Minister did and told him that he had to repay those inappropriate expenses. Senator Duffy then went on TV and told Canadians that that's what he had done. We know that obviously is not true. But to follow the leadership of this Prime Minister, as soon as he found out that that wasn't the case, he went back to his office. He's ordered his staff to work with and assist the RCMP. Contrast that to the leader of the NDP, who waited 17 years and still doesn't know whether it was important or not to inform the people of Quebec and Laval of the bribe that he was offered.
The Honourable Member for Hamilton Mountain.
Mr. Speaker, that's simply not accurate. The police only confirmed that they don't have evidence to indict the Prime Minister yet. The RCMP did not say whether he was aware of the cover-up scheme. Mr. Speaker, a dozen PMO staffers, public servants at Privy Council, senior senators, the head of the Conservative Fund were all working to deal with their Duffy disaster. The RCMP confirms the Prime Minister was aware of something. What was it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
I refer the honourable member to page 72 of the documents that she refers to, where it says that the Prime Minister, the RCMP, have no evidence that the Prime Minister knew anything about this scheme, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is also very clear is that the Prime Minister took immediate action. He took immediate action and ordered his office to assist with the RCMP. I contrast that to the Leader of the Opposition, who for 17 years sat on something that could have saved the people of Quebec many, many years of misery, millions and millions of dollars of grief, Mr. Speaker. He didn't think it was important then. He probably still doesn't think it's important, Mr. Speaker. That's not the type of leadership Canadians deserve from a government. That's why they have this Prime Minister and this government in office, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Mr. Speaker, an email from Senator Le Breton to Christopher Montgomery advised that the PMO not get involved in the Senate expense scandal. Despite these warnings, the PM staff did decide to doctor the facts contained in Deloitte's report. Did the Prime Minister and his employees believe they had the right to get involved in the Senate audit process by a so-called independent audit firm? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
That I've read, and in that report it says that the Prime Minister took immediate action, ordered his office to assist with the RCMP investigations, ordered that all emails pertaining to this be held for the RCMP, Mr. Speaker. That's the standard of leadership that Canadians expect. That's the standard of leadership they got from this Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Contrast that to the Leader of the Opposition, who for 17 years didn't think it was important to inform the people of Quebec, or inform the police of Quebec, that he had been offered a bribe, Mr. Speaker. And then, when it came out in the news that this was happening, he still didn't think it was important that he contact the police. He waited for them to contact him, Mr. Speaker. Real leadership is what the Prime Minister of Canada has shown, Mr. Speaker, day in and day out.
The honourable member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Mr. Speaker, the RCMP's information does not say that the Prime Minister did not know anything. The RCMP said that it still didn't have any evidence with regard to the Prime Minister's involvement into the finer details, but they have confirmed that he knew. There's a difference. Nigel wrote to the Prime Minister's staff, and I quote, Senator Le Breton admitted that Chris doesn't seem to agree. Agree with what exactly? The Parliamentary Secretary.
A number of months of questioning in the House of Commons, of course, after a number of months of investigation and by the RCMP, after having reviewed a number of emails and documents, the RCMP quite clearly say that I am not aware of any evidence that the Prime Minister was involved in the repayment or reimbursement of money to Senator Duffy or his lawyer, Mr. Speaker. That is right in black and white, Mr. Speaker. They can choose to read other parts of this report, but what is clear is the Prime Minister didn't know. Had he known, he would have in no way endorsed this scheme, Mr. Speaker. That's why I'm proud of the leadership that we show day in and day out, and that's why Canadians keep rewarding us with a majority government, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for La Pointe de l'Île. The less they answer, the more they dig themselves into a hole. Mr. Speaker, with regard to Nigel Wright actions, the RCMP's documents state, does the Prime Minister know of Andrew McDougall's actions? Wright answered that he personally assisted Duffy, and on Twitter he said that the Prime Minister had no knowledge. Why did he lie to reporters? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the less you answer, the bigger hole you get. Look at what the people of Quebec, the hole that they have been in because of 17 years of silence by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. Look at the Charbonneau Commission and what day in and day out the people of Quebec have had to endure for 17 years of silence from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. On the opposite side, Mr. Speaker, they have a Prime Minister who took immediate action, has shown leadership, and immediately ordered his office to participate and to assist with the RCMP, Mr. Speaker, so that they could have all of the information that they needed on this. That's real leadership, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I'm so proud of this Prime Minister and this government, Mr. Speaker.
The member for La Pointe de l'Île. The Conservatives don't understand that less they answer, the guiltier they look. Mr. Speaker, an email from Janice Payne to Benjamin Perrin talked of a bigger problem if ever they could not get rid of Deloitte's audit. Deloitte, I would like to remind you, is a firm which was supposed to conduct a so-called independent audit. What is this bigger problem? If they have nothing to hide, why call on party friends at Deloitte to stop or doctor the audit process? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The documents quite clearly outline who's the subject of the investigation. It's Nigel Wright and Senator Duffy, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, it shows the leadership that this Prime Minister took in ordering his office to assist. It also shows that the Prime Minister did not know what was happening with respect to this scheme. And as he said on a number of occasions, had he known, he would have in no way endorsed such a scheme. She's quite right, though. When you don't answer questions like the Leader of the Opposition did for 17 years, there are a lot of big problems, Mr. Speaker. I think the people of Quebec understand and don't appreciate the fact that for 17 years he held back the fact that he was given a bribe, Mr. Speaker. That's not real leadership, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that was fun. Let's try a little fact checks here. Now, the Prime Minister says he didn't know the details, but the RCMP said he was informed of the broad brushstrokes of the scheme. So what was he told about the negotiations between Nigel Wright as Chief of Staff, Benjamin Perrin, his personal lawyer, Janice Payne, Duffy's lawyer, and senior Conservative Senators Gersting and Takchuk to make the payoff and derail an audit investigation?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Again, Mr. Speaker, what is very clear is that it is Senator Duffy and Nigel Wright who are the subject of this investigation. Mr. Speaker, Senator Duffy accepted expenses which he did not incur. He was not entitled to these expenses, Mr. Speaker, and at the same time, Nigel Wright repaid those expenses. That was wrong. Nigel Wright has admitted that and is prepared to accept the consequences of that, Mr. Speaker. That's another reason why Senator Duffy was suspended from the Senate without pay, Mr. Speaker. That's the standard we expect on this side of the House. It's unfortunate that the NDP and the Liberals don't accept the same standard, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Okay, well, let's try this again. We're talking about the RCMP affidavits, not fiction here. According to the RCMP, Senator Irving Gersting was not only aware of the cover-up plans, he was an active participant. The RCMP say he contacted Deloitte official Michael Runia about stopping the audit into Michael Duffy's rip-off of the taxpayers. Now, it turns out that Michael Runia has donated over $6,000 to the Conservative Party. Now, do the Conservatives think this behavior is appropriate? What is the Prime Minister going to do to hold his buddy Irving Gersting to account?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Wow, Mr. Speaker, imagine this gentleman talking about donations when this is the party that accepted, what, $340,000 worth of illegal union donations, Mr. Speaker? Give me a break. He sits beside a member who made 29 separate donations to the Quebec Solidaire, Mr. Speaker. So on the one hand, you have a leader who doesn't think corruption is a big deal and doesn't report it for 17 years, sitting beside another person who wants to gerrymander the riding boundaries, sitting beside another person who wants to actually break apart the country, Mr. Speaker, and who somehow criticizes the brave men and women of our Canadian Armed Forces who have fought in wars, Mr. Speaker. I tell you what, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of people on that side who have a lot to answer for, Mr. Speaker. On this side,
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay. Order. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Well, God, that was tough talk, Mr. Speaker, from a man defending bribery, fraud, and corruption in the Prime Minister's office. So let's try and bring it back to reality. Now, Benjamin Perrin was the Prime Minister's personal lawyer. Now, RCMP documents reveal that Perrin's emails have been deleted and cannot be examined. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Library and Archives Act states, quote, no government or ministerial record shall be disposed of, including being destroyed, without the written consent of the librarian and archivist. So, simple question, did the Prime Minister's office get that consent before they erased this evidence?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, emails and documents upon the departure of a staff are managed according to applicable rules, including Treasury Board guidelines, and of course we expect all staff to follow those rules, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Westmount Ville-Marie.
Mr. Speaker, according to a sworn affidavit by the RCMP, David Van Hemmen, and I quote, made all the arrangements for Nigel Wright by dealing directly with Mr. Wright's bank, arranging for a transfer of funds from one account to another, picking up the bank draft in Ottawa and delivering it to the office of Duffy's lawyer. In the real world, he would get fired, but instead he was promoted to a senior role with the Minister of State for Finance. So I ask the Minister, why is David Van Hemmen still being paid by the Canadian taxpayer?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Well, Mr. Speaker, the report quite clearly states that it's Senator Duffy and Nigel Wright who are under investigation, Mr. Speaker. Look, if the standard was, of course, that he, as he says, Mr. Speaker, the entire Liberal caucus wouldn't be in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. They're surrounded by people who have broke the Canada Elections Act, Mr. Speaker. There are members in that caucus who were complicit or who worked to try and defraud Canadians of $40 million by funneling government advertising money to their riding associations, Mr. Speaker. So if he really wants to go down that road, Mr. Speaker, he might look at his own caucus and decide how many will be left of the 31 or 32, whatever there is, if he has that standard, Mr. Speaker. Get back to facts. Nigel Wright, Senator Duffy, that's what this is about, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Westmount, Bill Marie.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of State was asked a question about his personal staff. Why is he unable to even get up to defend his own hiring decision?
Well, there wasn't one.
Nous savons aussi maintenant.
We also now know that Chris Woodcock knew about the $90,000 check on March 8th and that he was subsequently involved in the cover-up of a criminal act, and yet he was later appointed Chief of Staff to the Minister of Natural Resources. How can the Minister trust such a secretive person? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
It is Senator Duffy and Nigel Wright who are the subject of this investigation. Senator Duffy accepted expenses that he was not entitled to accept, and Nigel Wright repaid those expenses. That was inappropriate, Mr. Speaker. He's prepared to accept the consequences. I hope that Senator Duffy will do the same, Mr. Speaker. But I ask again the honourable member, talk about working with people who have broken the rules and broken the laws. He's surrounded by people. You might want to ask them that very same question, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Westmount, Bill Marie.
Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable that a minister would hire this type of person and then refuse to defend his decision when asked a direct question. Another employee is being protected by the Conservatives, Patrick Rogers. He ordered Mike Duffy to stop cooperating with Deloitte. He tried to cover up Duffy and Wright's criminal acts instead of upholding the law. Today, he's the Director of Policy of the Minister of Canadian Heritage. Why did she hire someone who covered up criminal acts? The Parliamentary Secretary.
The documents released in court yesterday quite clearly show who the investigation is about. This is about Senator Duffy and Nigel Wright, Mr. Speaker. What they also show is a contrast in leadership styles between this Prime Minister and anybody in that caucus, Mr. Speaker. As soon as the Prime Minister knew about this, he ordered his staff to participate, to assist, to hold back any emails, Mr. Speaker, unlike the Liberal Party, who, when faced with a crisis in their government, decided to lie, cheat, and misplace $40 million, to which we still haven't found, Mr. Speaker. I'll take this style of leadership, this style of openness, and the leadership given by this Prime Minister day in and day out to anything the Liberals ever have to offer, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Mr. Speaker, for years the Conservatives have been saying that Canada has achieved half of its greenhouse gas emission objectives. For 2020, however, yesterday the Minister admitted that Canada had just done a quarter of that. For Conservatives, reducing GHGs is like the Senate, status quo and lies. When will they take action and get big polluters to pay?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, exactly the opposite is true. Our approach is working. Thanks to our actions, carbon emissions will actually go down close to 130 megatons from what they would have been under the Liberals. Now, let's just contrast our approach with the NDP approach. Yes. What their approach would be a $20 billion carbon tax. So let's take a look at what this would do to hard-working Canadian families. It would be a tax on electricity, a tax on transportation, a tax on heating, their homes, a tax on clothes and groceries for their kids, and the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. What we know is our approach is working, and Canadians don't want a $20 billion carbon tax from the NDP.
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Well, all that hot air from the parliamentary secretary isn't going to help us reduce emissions. Now, you'd think that if a past environment minister had to make up numbers to prove to the world that Canada's taking action on climate change, you'd think that the present one would actually act. But instead, the minister's most notable contribution to her first climate change conference, well, it was to demotivate global action on climate change. So much so that civil society walked out of the talks today. Do the Conservatives understand that it's their actions that made the international community leave those talks?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Environment.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the opposite's true. Our government has taken a leadership role to international climate change efforts, and we have been clear that any international agreement must be fair and effective and include commitments by all major emitters. That being said, Mr. Speaker, Canadians will be proud to know that our leadership on the world stage is being recognized by our international partners. Just yesterday, after concluding Canada's national statement at COP19, the Minister was approached by Angola, who personally thanked her for Canada's effort. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to protecting the environment, Angola, but we're committed, Mr. Speaker, and we'll get results without that.
The Honourable Member for Trinity Spadina.
5 months ago, this government refused the NDP's request to work together to improve rail safety. This week, the Transport Minister finally took a step forward, but Canadians will only be warned after the dangerous cargo already rolled through town. And rail companies' safety protocols are still kept secret. Why won't this government tell municipalities before the trains arrive what's in it and what safety measures are in place? What's there to hide, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, as the member well knows, this minister issued a protective direction directing rail companies to share information with municipalities. It ensures that companies who transport dangerous goods provide municipalities with information on the nature and volume of dangerous goods the company transports by rail to that municipality. Mr. Speaker, we did that by working with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who said this, that protective direction, quote, sends a clear message that the Government of Canada fully agrees that local governments need to know basic information about dangerous goods being transported through their communities. That's the President of FCM, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, still have solutions. The Minister of Transport should put in place all of the Auditor General's recommendations. Now, the Minister has taken a step in the right direction with respect to the passing on of information with respect to the movements of dangerous goods, but it would be preferable for the information to be passed on before the train goes through, not after. What's more, there's still no time frame with respect to the withdrawal of the .111 wagons, which are deemed unsafe. Will the Minister finally work with us to implement a real railway safety policy?
Mr. Speaker, the member will know that the Minister and this government have been taking consistent action in the light of the tragedy at Lac-Megantic. Mr. Speaker, new protective orders with respect to the testing and classification of crude oil products and the communication of that important information, Mr. Speaker, emergency directives on the transportation of dangerous goods by rail, and now a new protective directive on information sharing with municipalities. All of that done with our partners in the provinces and the FCM, Mr. Speaker, and it's the FCM who said very clearly, Mr. Speaker, that the federal government has now responded, and we commend them for it.
The Honourable Member for Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians know that the only party that stands up for the rights of law-abiding hunters, farmers and sport shooters is the Conservative Party. We passed legislation to end the wasteful and ineffective law and gun registry once and for all and delete all of the records. However, today the Supreme Court decided to hear the Government of Quebec's attempt to hold on to the outdated and useless data. Could the Minister of Public Safety please update this House on the Government's position on this matter? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Medicine Hat for his excellent question. I'd like to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that we accept the decision of the Supreme Court and that we're going to continue to put in place measures to make our streets safer and to respect our hunters, farmers, and sport shooters.
Defend our legislation passed by elected members of this Parliament in front of the Supreme Court. Thank you.
The honourable member for St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, the Chief of Defence Staff said that when it comes to cuts in the size of the regular force, quote, direction has not been given to us yet. Mr. Speaker, this government once promised 75,000 regular force members and 35,000 reservists. We're not close to that now. Can the Minister confirm if the number of uniformed members of the Canadian Armed Forces will be cut?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
No, I can't, Mr. Speaker. As Budget 2012 stated, and I quoted, we will maintain CAF regular force strength at 68,000 and reserve force strength at 27,000, Mr. Speaker. All the cuts that he was talking about, Mr. Speaker, those were done by the Liberals, supported by the NDP. That's what I think he's referring to.
The Honourable Member for Jacques-Cartier. Here again, we still didn't get an answer. The CDS hasn't received clear directives either as to whether or not military bases would have to be cut or there would have to be cuts to Canadian forces so that the Conservatives can balance the budget in time for the elections. There's utter confusion, and it's the Minister of Defence's fault. CF members at Valcartier and their families want answers. Yes or no, will the government close bases and facilities, and if yes, which ones?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Again, Mr. Speaker, bases that were cut were done by the Liberals, supported by the NDP. Mr. Speaker, he talks about confusion. The confusion is all within their caucus, Mr. Speaker. As the Chief of Defence Staff said, and I quote, certainly the government has not indicated a desire to cut numbers. As a matter of fact, as I indicated in Budget 2012, the force strength will be at 68,000 and the reserve strength at 27,000. We will support our men and women in armed forces, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, it's not just service members who want some answers. Veterans do too. Hundreds of veterans are facing discrimination because of the new disability allocation for the Conservatives. But instead of helping veterans, the Minister of Veterans Affairs has asked a committee to outline the government's legal obligations to them. Instead of being concerned about their legal obligations, the Conservatives should focus on their moral obligations. Will the Minister be enhancing the disability allocation for veterans? The Honourable Minister.
That no matter what one does to improve the quality of life and support for veterans and their families, that member is obviously not on side. This is certainly a move that we're making to enhance the quality of life and the support for our veterans. She can, if she wishes, contribute to that effort ongoing, as we have done all along. Mr. Speaker, the comprehensive review of the new Veterans Charter is a step forward. It's a continuation of our good work, which over the last 5-6 years has added some $5 billion in programs and services to our veterans and their families.
The Honourable Member for Sackville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, by the time you and all Canadians go to bed tonight, we will lose 150 World War II Korean and modern-day veterans, either due to illness or through the aging process, Mr. Speaker, and 2/3 of those impoverished veterans and their families will not be able to qualify for the last post fund because the litmus test is still at $12,000 for the entry level. That's what the Liberals gave us back in 1995, when at that time it was $24,000. 20 years later, Mr. Speaker, it is still at $12,000. Mr. Speaker, by allowing these families and the heroes of our country to have a dignified burial and cremation service, it is the last chance that a grateful nation gets to say goodbye and thank you. So will the government now raise that litmus test so that more veterans and their families can have a dignified service they so rightfully deserve?
Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and his demonstrated concern for the welfare of our veterans and their families. I also thank the Parliamentary Budget Officer for highlighting how our government doubled the financial limit of the funeral and burial program, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to work with veterans groups to ensure the Canadian funeral and burial program remains one of the most generous of our allies. And I urge the honourable member and all interested parties who can in fact contribute to any changes they would wish to make by appearing in front of the Parliamentary Committee delving into the new Veterans Charter.
Here, here. The honourable member for Vancouver, Quadro.
Mr. Speaker, we know the Prime Minister's lawyer, Benjamin Perrin, assured Nigel Wright there would be no written evidence of the deal to repay Mike Duffy's fraudulent expenses. When a lawyer doesn't want something put on paper, it's because they've something to hide. In this case, it was the fraud squad's job to wipe the Prime Minister's fingerprints off the deal. The Prime Minister can no longer pretend he didn't know what all his senior staff were up to. When will he finally tell Canadians the truth? 17 years from now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, finally we can agree on something that it was extraordinarily inappropriate for the Leader of the Opposition to wait 17 years to talk about a bribe that he was offered, Mr. Speaker. I'm usually, of course, very critical of this member's questions. That still remains the same, but at least on the one point we agree. The Leader of the Opposition shouldn't have waited 17 years to disclose that he was offered a bribe. He could have saved the people of Quebec so many years of misery. That's not the standard of leadership Canadians expect, and that's why this Prime Minister is in office today and will be for a long time to come, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Random, Buren, St. George.
With the PMO under RCMP investigation, court filings show that the Prime Minister's claim that no one in his office was informed about the Wright-Duffy deal is patently false. His entire senior staff appears to be one big fraud squad. Woodcock, Rogers, Van Hemen, Hilton, Hamilton, and of course Conservative Senators Gerstein, Tkachuk, Stuart Olson, and LeBreton. If the Prime Minister is truly angry about this scandal, why do all of these people still have their jobs?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, and as the report clearly outlines, the Prime Minister showed incredible leadership. The moment he found out about this, he went into his office and ordered that his office and the PMO cooperate, all emails be preserved, Mr. Speaker, and that they assist the RCMP in this investigation, Mr. Speaker. That's the standard of leadership that Canadians expect. That's the standard of leadership they got from this Prime Minister. At the same time, this is about Nigel Wright. As these documents completely show, it's about Nigel Wright and Senator Duffy, and the Prime Minister did not know about this, and had he known about it, he would have never endorsed such a scheme, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, here's a standard of leadership. 1 billion litres of toxic coal slurry was released into the Athabasca River from an abandoned coal mine. The federal government's responsible for regulating industrial facilities to prevent such catastrophic you can say it. Catastrophic. Got it. Incidents. Give me more time. The obvious response to a disaster of this scale is to ensure no other industrial facilities along this river pose similar risks. Has the government taken immediate action to ensure no such incidents occur, including in the oil sands?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, we don't think this is a laughing matter. The Environment Canada is supporting the province and providing assistance as required. Our government has committed to enshrining the polluter pay system into law. Environment Canada's enforcement officers are looking into the situation, and our government will continue to take action against those who break environmental laws. You know what, Mr. Speaker, I'm standing here and they're mocking a third world country, okay? It's upsetting when you look at the environment. This is something that we take seriously. We spend $1.2 billion helping countries around the world, and that's something we're...
The Honourable Member for Western Arctic.
Well, looking into the situation isn't good enough, Mr. Speaker. This federal government has clear responsibility over the protection of fisheries, northern and transboundary waters. We don't want to wait for Alberta. The disaster is already impacting communities downstream from the site of the spill. Monitoring the situation is not good enough. When will enforcement action be carried out by this government? What is Environment Canada doing to protect the people in the Mackenzie Basin?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to protecting our environment, and we are beefing up, if that member was paying attention, environmental laws we're setting a higher safety standard and creating mandatory minimum sentences for individuals who violate environmental laws.
Right.
And as I said, it's our government that has committed to enshrining the polluter pay system into law, and will continue to take action against those who break the environmental laws. And it would be nice, Mr. Speaker, if the NDP, if they actually believed in this, would actually vote and support our government in these actions.
Right on. The honourable member for West Loch St. Paul.
On Tuesday, the Liberal MP from Westmont Ville Marie urged Canada to jeopardize its security and military relationship with the United States. Yet this was the same Liberal Party that had no issue with the fact that our Canadian armed forces would be exposed to cluster munitions in Afghanistan simply by working on joint missions with the United States. The Liberals can't have it both ways. On this side of the House, we understand the importance of taking real action on the destruction of cluster munitions, while at the same time never wavering from our commitment to the men and women in uniform. Can the Minister of Foreign Affairs please comment on the government's response to rid the world of cluster munitions?
Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Speaker, let me say that I was very surprised that the Liberal Party wants to abandon our partnership with the Obama administration on world peace and security. That is terribly disturbing, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to say that Canada has never used or produced cluster munitions. And as part of our leadership on this issue, not only will we fully ratify and honor all the obligations in the Cluster Munitions Treaty, we will also spend $10 million over the next 18 months to support assistance and demining efforts of these terrible weapons, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, Jenny Byrne is the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. Well, she's holed up in some hotel in Brandon for the by-election. She's no stranger to the executing of deceptive phone campaigns. Things are going so well in the Prime Minister's office that I guess he does not need his Deputy Chief of Staff here in Ottawa. Question is, what public business is Jenny Byrne conducting in Brandon, and is she reporting to Elections Canada twice daily on her daily routine?
The Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that would be too easy, since this member is surrounded by people who have broken the rules. He's surrounded by people who have broken the Canada Elections Act. He's surrounded by members who have been charged of robocalls, Mr. Speaker. We know they're only talking of Brandon-Souris today. Come next week, they're not going to talk about it at all, Mr. Speaker. I think the people of Brandon-Souris believe like the people of my riding do. They want lower taxes, Mr. Speaker. They'll get that with a Conservative. They don't want a gun registry. They'll get that with a Conservative. They want marketing freedom for their farmers. They'll get that with a Conservative. They're proud of democracy. They'll get that with the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker. On every issue that matters, it's the Conservatives who will always stand up for the people of Brandon-Souris.
The honourable member for Newton, North Delta.
Work has stopped on retrofits and development at Seaforth Armories in Vancouver. Subcontractors who started work more than 6 months ago still haven't been paid for what should have been a straightforward government contract. These are hard-working, independent business owners being forced into financial hardship and forced to walk off the job. Will the minister take responsibility for work done for his department and ensure these contractors are paid?
The Honourable Minister of Public Works.
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously we want to make sure that all employees right across the country are paid according to the rules, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
In certain cases, there are situations where there are subcontractors who must rely on the integrity of their employers to do the right thing. We will do everything we can to make sure that those contractors do so.
Well said. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg South Centre.
Monsieur le Président. Mr. Speaker, the Lac-Megantic tragedy affected all Canadians. The situation required a specific response on the part of Canada, and everyone agrees that decontamination is a priority and that we had to get down to business and rebuild. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister inform this House of measures or steps taken to help this community recover? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her excellent work here in the House. Mr. Speaker, today the Prime Minister announced additional assistance for Lac-Megantic and its inhabitants. We have always said that we would be there for them, and we're showing once again our commitment today. The support announced will help to decontaminate zones affected in order to permit the community to rebuild. We are taking steps to ensure that people responsible for these spills pick up the tab and will continue to improve railway safety across the country. Honourable Member for Gatineau. The Conservatives want to withdraw all reference to climate change and environment, but by eradicating the Going Green strategy for the National Capital Commission. So they're going to be planting trees instead of being carbon neutral. They're going to abolish the objectives to enable us to measure climate change in the region. And they're convinced that they're going to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. But if the NCC doesn't take into account its greenhouse gas emissions, then how will it know what percentage reduction there will be? The Honourable Minister.
The Capital Commission does a phenomenal job at managing not only Gatineau Park but the Greenbelt on the Ottawa side of the Ottawa River. It has numerous initiatives for responsible environmental policies and responsible environmental management, and we have a lot of confidence that they'll continue to do an extraordinary job managing these important assets that not just are here in the National Capital Region, but they're the pride of all Canadians.
Honourable Member for Thunder Bay Superior North.
Mr. Speaker, this week, Thunder Bay City Council voted unanimously to condemn the closure of the Veterans Affairs offices in Thunder Bay and across Canada. Mayor Keith Hobbs called this abandonment of our veterans shameful. I've received hundreds of messages from those who are revolted by the shoddy treatment of our veterans. Will the Conservatives please listen to the residents of Thunder Bay, Superior North, and reverse these closures?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, any seriously injured veteran does not have to leave their home. We will visit them at their home.
There you go.
We will, in fact, cut their grass. We will, in fact, clean their homes. We'll shovel their snow. And, Mr. Speaker, we're doing a fabulous job for veterans in support of them. The feedback I get is that Veterans Canada, Veterans Affairs Canada, and the Canadian people are looking after them. Sure, there's things to be done more, and that's why we're having the review of the Charter, Mr. Speaker.
Well said. That concludes question period for today. Before I recognize the Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, I know all members will be very excited this weekend to take in the 101st Grey Cup. And I know this House probably has divided loyalties, but for the rest of the day as we sit here and contemplate, let's think of the foresight and indeed maybe a providential choice by the Fathers of Confederation to choose green to be the color of the House of Commons. I believe the Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Canso has a point of order.
Yes, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, and good luck this weekend with that. But I'd be remiss if I didn't stand on this particular point of order, and that in response to one of his questions, one of the non-answers given by the Parliamentary Secretary was, in fact, he misled the House in saying that our party has not raised the issue of Veterans Affairs, when in fact I stood here in the House myself and talked about the closure of the offices in Sydney, Mr. Speaker. I asked them to stand.
Sounds like a continuation of debate. Now I see the Honourable Member for Hamilton Centre rising, and I'll recognize him with a certain degree of reluctance.
I can't imagine why, Speaker. With the greatest of respect, I certainly can't challenge your opinion or your authority, but it needs to be said on the floor here as we head into this weekend. Oski Wee-Wee!
Well, now I think we can move on to the Thursday question. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Speaker. You've only yourself to blame for that one, Speaker.
That's right.
I'm sorry to say the questions this week for looking forward to government business are a bit complicated, in such that there have been so many particular scandals flowing around this government and other right-wing governments across this country, particularly in Toronto. It's been difficult to keep up with the actual business of the House. Traditionally, as you will know, Mr. Speaker, right up until the very last general election, it has always been the practice in this place to have the parties consult constructively on what can get done in Canada's House of Commons. That practice has utterly vanished under the current government. même quand l'opposition suggère.
Even when the opposition suggests that we pass bills quickly, the government does not accept our cooperation. And this is something that is bizarre and goes against our practices here. Today, for example, we could have easily passed and sent to committee a bill that is important and deals with air and marine transportation.